Hi, I'm Richard Pettigrew and I teach philosophy at the University of Bristol in the UK. And I'm going to talk today about this book, which has just been published by Oxford University Press, called Epistemic Risk and the Demands of Rationality. In 1877, the British mathematician William Kingdon Clifford published a philosophical essay called The Ethics of Belief. In it, he wrote, "It is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence." In the 1890s, the American philosopher and psychologist William James gave a lecture at Harvard intended to rebut Clifford's claim. It contains an intriguing passage which has been picked up by philosophers and used for many different purposes. He wrote, "There are two ways of looking at our duty in the matter of opinion. We must know the truth, and we must avoid error. These," James continues, "are two materially different laws, and by choosing between them, we may end by colouring differently our whole intellectual life." He goes on, "We may regard the chase for truth as paramount and the avoidance of error as secondary, or we may, on the other hand, treat the avoidance of error as the more imperative and let truth take its chance." Clifford, whom James elsewhere describes as a delicious enfant terrible because of his robustious pathos in his writing, exhorts us to the latter course. James says, "Believe nothing," Clifford tells us. "Keep your mind in suspense forever rather than by closing it on insufficient evidence, and thereby incur the awful risk of believing lies. You, on the other hand, may think that the risk of being in error is a very small matter when compared to the blessings of real knowledge, and be ready to be duped many times in your investigation rather than postpone indefinitely the chance of guessing true." End quote. In my most recent book, Epistemic Risks and the Demands of Rationality, I try to spell out in detail the idea that James articulates here. James himself goes on to use this idea to argue that there's nothing irrational about religious faith. I have no interest in that question specifically, and the book doesn't consider it or try to accommodate all of the aspects of James's view. Instead, I want to use James's insight to argue for a general claim about the rationality of your beliefs. In the philosophical literature, this view is known as permissivism about epistemic rationality. So let's unpack that. It's a claim about epistemic rationality. So the first question is, what's that? In fact, it's got two aspects. First, it means it's a claim about the rationality of those things that we study in epistemology, such as the beliefs we have, the claims we think are true, our opinions about things, the strength of our confidence in different matters, and so on. Clifford's claim concerns the wrongness of having beliefs in certain situations. James talks of our duty in the matter of opinion. So this is a claim about the rationality of beliefs broadly conceived. But it's slightly more than that. You can have many different sorts of reasons for having a particular belief. You might have aesthetic reasons. The belief might form part of a worldview that you hold because it is elegantly simple or intricately complex. You might have moral reasons. Canadian philosopher Rima Basu, for instance, thinks that you have moral reasons not to believe certain negative things about someone on the basis of purely statistical evidence about a group to which they belong. You might have practical or pragmatic reasons. If you could only bring yourself to believe in God, perhaps you can avoid terrible punishment at the hands of a zealous government. Or you might have theoretical reasons for a belief. You might believe something because it's true, or because it's well supported by your evidence. It's these reasons, these theoretical reasons, that we're interested in here. So the sort of rationality that concerns us is epistemic in two senses. It concerns beliefs, but it's also concerned with purely theoretical reasons for having those beliefs, rather than aesthetic ones or moral ones or pragmatic ones. Okay, so that's what epistemic rationality is. Now, what does it mean for it to be permissive? It means that, at least in some cases, the evidence you have does not pin down exactly what you should think or not think. The opposite view, aptly called impermissivism, says that whatever evidence you've managed to accumulate and whatever matter you're considering, there's exactly one opinion that it is rational for you to have about that matter. So if you're talking about all or nothing beliefs, that is, the sorts of things that we report when we say, I think it will rain tomorrow. What impermissivism says is that your evidence determines completely whether you should believe something or not. If instead you're talking about beliefs that come in degrees, so that is the sort of things we report when we say, I'm 90% confident it will rain tomorrow, I'm 45% likely to snow, then this means your evidence, then in this case determinism, says that your evidence determines exactly how strongly you should believe something. And permissivism says the opposite. Sometimes it says your evidence gives you some wiggle room. Sometimes there's more than one rational response to it. So, for instance, someone with your evidence might be perfectly epistemically rational if they were to think it 45% likely to snow tomorrow, but no less epistemically rational if they were to think it's 46% likely. That is, epistemic rationality, on this view, gives a little wiggle room. I think Clifford's an impermissivist, so take the evidence you have, ask whether it's sufficient for belief. If it is, rationality requires you to believe. If it isn't, rationality requires you not to believe. James, on the other hand, is a permissivist. In certain situations, which he spells out in quite a lot of detail in the essay, rationality will allow you to believe, but it will also allow you not to believe. I side with James. Now, there isn't just one permissivist position, there are many. Some permissivists think most evidence does in fact pin down what you should do, but there are at least some situations where it permits more than one response. Perhaps when your evidence is very limited or highly complex or pulls you in different directions. Some think whenever it does permit more than one response, those responses aren't very different from each other. It permits thinking something's 45% likely or 46% likely or anything in between those, but nothing more. While others think that a very broad range of opinions is permissible. I come down on the more radical side. I think it's very common to have evidence that permits a very wide range of opinions. Now, hopefully it's clear why this conclusion, if it's correct, is important. It may scupper any hopes of a wholly objective science. It might affect how we respond when, in a criminal trial, we are asked whether what the defendant claims to have believed when they acted is something that a reasonable person would have believed in their situation. And as I discuss in the final chapter of the book, it might affect how we understand conspiracy theorists and the wrongs they do to others when they act on their conspiracist beliefs. So how do I get to that conclusion? I draw inspiration from two intriguing elements in the passage from James's essay that I quoted at the beginning. First, he says, there are two ways of looking at our duty in the matter of opinion. We must know truth, and we must avoid error. Now, there are clearly other ways to read this, but one approach, it suggests, is a teleological conception of epistemic rationality. That is, it suggests that facts about what is epistemically rational depend upon facts about what is epistemically good. Just as in ethics, according to the utilitarian approach is teleological, since what it is morally right for me to do, according to that approach, depends on facts about what will produce the most morally relevant good. The teleological approach I take is sometimes called accuracy first epistemology. It says that your opinions are better the more accurate they are. So, for instance, if it in fact will rain tomorrow, then I do better by thinking it 80% likely to rain than by thinking it 40% likely to rain. Since the perfect opinion to have about something that is true is to be 100% certain of it. And 80% is closer to that than 40% is. If it will not rain, on the other hand, then I do better by thinking it 40% likely that it will than by thinking it 80% likely, since the perfect opinion to have about something that's false is to think it 0% likely. How do we determine what is epistemically rational on the basis of this conception of what is epistemically good? Now, at this point, we turn to decision theory. Now, that might surprise you, since you might think decision theory is only relevant to your practical reasons for doing things. But actually, decision theory is really a collection of principles that allow us to determine which means it is rational to take to pursue our ends. In the standard way we use it, that end is something pragmatic or practical, like utility. It tells us which actions are rational means to take in our pursuit of that. But in our case, the end is accuracy, and decision theory tells us which sets of credences are rational means towards that. So take, for instance, the decision theoretic principle of dominance. And what this says is that it's irrational to pick an option if there's another that's guaranteed to be better than it. So in the context of accuracy first epistemology, this says it's irrational to have one set of opinions when there's another set you might have instead that's guaranteed to be more accurate than yours. Now, there's a result, originally due to Jim Joyce, that's become something of a cornerstone of this approach, and it relies on the dominance principle. And we can use it to justify the norm that goes by the name of probabilism and that underpins much scientific reasoning under uncertainty. Probabilism says that your degrees of belief should be structured in the way that the axioms of probability theory demand. So, for instance, you shouldn't be more confident that it will rain tomorrow than you are that it will rain or snow. Now, it turns out that if you measure accuracy in the right way, and if your degrees of belief do not do as the probability axioms say they should, then there are alternative degrees of belief that are guaranteed to be more accurate than yours. So dominance, combined with this sort of accuracy first account of what makes opinions better and worse, implies probabilism. So the next stage of the book's argument seeks further decision principles like the dominance principle. And it's at this point that the second element of William James's essay enters. James notes that to adopt a belief is a risky business. He talks of the awful risk of believing lies. If you believe something strongly, you risk being very inaccurate if it's false. But you also open up the possibility of being very accurate if it's true. If instead you have a pretty middling degree of belief, 50%, 55%, then you're guaranteed to be not very inaccurate. But you're also guaranteed not to be very accurate. You close off the possibility of being very accurate. The more risk-averse you are, the more weight you give to how things go when they go worst. You put more weight on the worst-case scenario. For a belief, they go worst when they're most inaccurate. So if you're risk-averse, you'll favour more middling degrees of belief that preclude worst-case scenarios that are too bad. The more risk-inclined you are, on the other hand, the more weight you give to the best-case scenarios, and you'll favour more extreme degrees of belief, high degrees of belief like 80%, 90%, 95%. Because they open up for you the possibility of great accuracy, although they also risk great inaccuracy. William James thinks that our attitudes to epistemic risk, whether we're risk-inclined or risk-averse, are subjective aspects of ourselves. That is, he's permissivist about epistemic risk. Just as it's rationally permissible for you to love Brahms's music and for me to loathe it, so it's rational for me to be epistemically risk-inclined and for you to be epistemically risk-averse. James talks about our attitudes to epistemic risk being part of our passional nature. In the final chapters of the book, I formulate a vast family of decision principles that encode different attitudes to risk, and I ask what opinions they allow. If you're permissive about epistemic risk in the way that James is, then it turns out that for most opinions you might have, and most bodies of evidence you might have accumulated, there are permissive attitudes to risk that would permit you to have those opinions when you have that evidence. That is, for most views that you could have, and depending on what evidence you have, there are going to be certain attitudes to epistemic risk such that if they are your attitudes, then it's rational for you to have those views, given that you have that evidence. So in conclusion, you get a radical permissivism about epistemic rationality. Now let me wrap up by assuaging a fear that you might have. By siding with James over Clifford, you might think, am I proposing that sometimes it's okay to believe in a way that it's not supported by your evidence? Is it okay sometimes to go against or go beyond your evidence? In fact, I'm not. What we mean by saying an opinion is supported by the evidence is simply that it is epistemically rational to have that opinion when you have that evidence. There is no question of an opinion being supported by evidence that's prior to the question of what is rational to think. This, I think, was the great error of Maynard Keynes, Rudolf Carnap, and many who came after them. They thought there was some objective measure of the extent to which a body of evidence supports a proposition, the sort of thing that Tim Williamson calls an evidential probability. But there isn't. There's just the question of whether it's rational to believe a proposition to a certain degree when you have that evidence. And that question, I think, should not be answered by appealing to this notion of strength of evidential support. I don't think there is any prior notion that we can appeal to prior to answering the question we're interested in. Instead, we should answer the question using the teleological approach that finds its origin in William James's will to believe.